So here we go for this new series. As you can see by this very straightforward graphic, we are beginning a new series today on the topic of Sabbath. Uh, I think a strong case could be made that Sabbath is one of the most misunderstood concepts and practices in the Bible amongst Christians. Uh, It seems that almost no Christian holds in common with another Christian an identical conviction about Sabbath. Even amongst the books written on the topic, and there are many, you will find much agreement, and you will also find difference in personal application on the best way to Sabbath. Geographical location even contributes to Sabbath conclusions. For example, Christian farmers in Saskatchewan don't Sabbath the same way Christian emergency room nurses in Toronto Sabbath. And so, to say it simply, Sabbath and the particulars are widely debated. Further clouding the Sabbath picture is the way that society and culture function. Day after day, all of us are discipled away from weekly days of intentional rest. Work, consumerism, materialism, greed, technology, recreation, sports, kids' sports, etc., keep us going all the time. And it's interesting to consider how often people now express that they will be glad when the weekend is over. This is a thing I don't remember hearing growing up. But more and more I hear people say, oh, I'll just be glad when this weekend is over. Because the weekend is now often more demanding than the week. Work is more restful than not being at work somehow. Not to participate in all sorts of activities that we deem good, and dare I say, character building, each weekend is becoming foreign to us, if it isn't already. And then what about stress and anxiety and burnout? These words are as common in our vocabulary as fun and food. And I suspect that everyone in this room speaks of anxiety and stress and burnout more than they do many of the other common words in our vocabulary. And then we give a whole litany of reasons for our stress and our burnout and anxiety. Sometimes it's excuses, sometimes it's justifications, sometimes it's a fatalist approach, like it's just the way it is. And yet we're all trying to solve this mental health epidemic through a variety of ways and through a variety of prescriptions. Yet we rarely try the gift of God that is intentional Sabbath. You see, Sabbath is a very real source of healing and recovery, and yet it remains a mystery or a fantasy to many Christians. People that I would argue should understand rest and recovery better than anybody on earth. And yet we are some of the most debilitated. Sabbath is familiar, but it is also far away. It's far away from our homes, it's far away from our families, it's far away from our lives. And so for the next 5 weeks, we're going to explore this ancient practice of Sabbath. We're going to look at the origins of Sabbath. We are going to look at the place of Sabbath in the Old Testament. We're going to look at the place of Sabbath in the life of Jesus. We're going to look at the place of Sabbath in the epistles. And then on week number 5, we are going to try to do our best to explore some of the big questions that new covenant believers, Christians in the church age, would have about Sabbath. Like things like, do you have to Sabbath on Sunday? Hint, no. But some people feel very, very strongly about it. And then we'll look at some tips on how you can begin to practice Sabbath in your own home if that's not something that you have ever really made a habit of doing. Now, I confess that the grandness and the deepness and the significance of this topic actually is quite intimidating for me. And it was preparing it. I may have spent more time preparing for this sermon today than I have spent preparing for a sermon in years. I'm not an expert on this topic. I confess I am a beginner on this topic. I'm not a professional Sabbather. I'm someone that has not done this very well. And so this is an invitation for you to consider not what I am an authority on, but something that I am exploring and trying to journey into in a way that will matter to me and people I care about. Uh, I've looked at a handful of resources to contribute to this study. I'm going to quote from many of these over the next 5 weeks, so I thought for those of you that do like to read, it might be appreciated if I shared some like a reading list for this series. So here's a few of the titles that I've relied on mostly, we could say. There are others, but this is sort of the big list. So The Sabbath by Abraham Heschel. He is now passed away. He is a Polish Jew. He is not a believer, but maybe the gold standard on Sabbath of anybody that's ever written on the topic. Garden City by John Mark Comer, probably my favorite book out of this collection. The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, John Mark Comer, Deeply Formed Life, Rich Viotis, Sacred Rhythms, Ruth Haley Barton, The Rest of God, by Canadian Mark Buchanan, and Keeping the Sabbath Holy, Marva J. Don, as recommended by my friend and brother, Mr. Gene Hugo. So where do we start then? That's the introduction to the series. That's the foreword to the book. Now we got to get into today. So where do we start? I probably think it's best to start with a definition, rather than assuming we all even know what Sabbath is. So I'm going to give you a technical definition, then we'll kind of reduce it, and then move on. So coming out of the Anchor Yale Bible Dictionary, the word Sabbath designates in the Bible the weekly seventh day of festal rest, which is a day of abstination from secular work that follows each 6-day working week. That's wordy. So here's a less technical definition. The Sabbath is a 24-hour period set aside to stop, rest, delight, and worship. A little bit more word study for you. The word Sabbath comes from the Hebrew word Shabbat, which means to stop or cease, to be complete, and to celebrate. Brief description of Sabbath, in case you've never heard what it is. This is where we're heading. To dive into the specifics of this morning, we're going to circle back on something I've kind of already said, but for those of us who've been Christians for a long time, especially those of us who came from a Christian home, I think a lot of times we begin our Sabbath consideration, our Sabbath exploration, from a half-formed argument about grace and law. And then we don't take the Sabbath that seriously because we're under grace. We start from a place of discounting the Sabbath's value, discounting the necessity of Sabbath practice because of grace, and we're not under law. Wasn't that for the Jews in the Old Testament? And we probably also start from a place of inherited Sabbath practices or convictions from our parents or other mature Christian influences in our life. And it probably goes one of two ways. Either we're kind of legalistic about the Sabbath, God bless you if you are, or we didn't really do much with it growing up. So we're pretty wishy-washy about the whole thing. It's hard to Sabbath like halfway in. It's sort of I'm serious about it or I'm not. And so what Sabbath is or isn't, or how it should or should not be observed, is like a scrapbook of Sabbath notes. And I'm sure you would agree most of us don't form our deepest convictions or our deepest learnings from scrapbooks. I mean, imagine attending a fourth-year university class and the teacher handing you their scrapbook of their favorite topic. You go, what on earth is this? And yet that's sort of how we approach Sabbath. Just some tidbits taped and stapled into the pages of our life. And they've left us many wandering in a murky middle of this Sabbath story. Somewhere between the garden and the heavenly city, a place between law and grace, with a sprinkle of what our parents said and did, or didn't say and didn't do. All equating probably to nothing. Or at best, a practice that we label Sabbath, even though that practice means very little and accomplishes not much, other than helping to alleviate some guilt if we don't get our task done on Sunday, because then we can at least play the Sabbath card and feel justified that we didn't check that box off. And so instead of starting in the middle, we're going to go to the beginning of the Sabbath story. We're going to get out of this murky middle that most of us wander in. Go right to the beginning, a time before the debates of law and grace, a time before Israel or the church, a time before our parents told us so, a time when there were no shops to be open or closed on Sundays, a time before rural life or urban life formed us into our rest habits, a time called the beginning in a place called the Garden of Eden. You can go to Genesis chapter 2. Before we read this verse, I'm just going to pray. So, God of rest, we praise you for your unique idea of ceasing. Something so hard for us, foreign to us, something we have to learn to do. I pray now, O Spirit of God, that you would be with your people, that you would lead us into your rest, that you would comfort us and challenge us for the sake of our very souls, which you love. We commit this meditation to you. Use it, we pray. Amen. Genesis 2, verses 1 and 2. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. So Genesis 1 and 2, the two chapters to kick the whole Bible off, include two descriptions of the creation narrative, creation of the heavens and the earth. And most of us are reasonably familiar with the creation narrative, even if we're not particularly well versed in the Bible. We probably have some idea of in the beginning God created. But like we do with many passages in the Bible, we read the account of creation, and more specifically, what we could say the account of the advent of the seventh day of rest, very generally. And we miss the specifics of this that enrich our understanding of the passage and the idea that is contained within these little verses. And so in the case of the seventh day, looking past the specific words and jumping right to the general idea is at least some of the reason that I think we don't really understand Sabbath. We don't even know how it started or why. And we settle for general takeaways like, well, God rested, so should we. Or work is awesome. God worked 6 days and he only rested 1 day. So we should rest 1 day, but we want to make sure we work hard on 6 days because tasks, after all, make the world go round. And there's Sunday school lessons, and they're okay, and there's some truth in those. But they're hardly reason enough for anyone who doesn't have a pretty big appetite for legalism to take the Sabbath that seriously. And so what makes the day of rest so compelling for me, and maybe for you too, if we think about this, isn't so much what it is, but why it is. Why the Sabbath exists at all. Because most of us don't commit to much in life without understanding why. And maybe that's our struggle with the Sabbath. We were told what it was without being told why it is. And so the first why of Sabbath is because God rested. So the word rested in verse 3 is the Hebrew word Shabbat. We talked about this word. God ceased, he stopped, he rested, he took a break. And because we are made in the image of God, the only thing in all the earth made in the image of God, we rest because God rested and we are like him. We stop and we enjoy the work that was because God stopped and enjoyed the work he did. That's the first why. If you've never heard that, now you know. Why do we Sabbath? Because God thinks it's a good idea to stop. But it goes obviously deeper than that. And in the description of God's rest on the seventh day, we come across two key words that really form the whole discussion this morning. These key words are both found in verse 3. It says, God blessed the seventh day, and he called the seventh day holy. Blessed and holy. So at the heart of the question why we Sabbath is because the seventh day is blessed and holy. So we begin with blessed and a Bible trivia question. How many times in the creation narratives does God call something blessed? Do you know it? More than one. It's like we could get into the whole idea of that there's popular biblical numbers, and you could probably guess just based on that. It's not 7. It's not 7. 3. There it is. 3 times God calls something blessed. Here's the 3 times. God blessed the living creatures, and he said, be fruitful and multiply. And he blessed the humans, and he said, be fruitful and multiply. And then he blessed the seventh day. The Hebrew word translated as blessed is the word barak. Yes, like the former president. I'll let you decide based on your own politics if that was a blessing or not. The word bless means to fill with strength, to adore, to put special favor upon something. And particularly God's favor, to confer God's favor on a thing. And so in the creation narrative, God places a unique favor on the living creatures, a unique favor on people, and then a unique favor on the day of rest. And that blessing, that unique favor, is not put on the other parts of creation, and it is not put on the other 6 days of work. It is put on the 7th day, the day of rest only. And the special blessing causes, this is the best part, each of the receivers of this blessing to do something distinct. That is to bring new life from themselves. So the living creatures are to be fruitful and multiply. That is, bring life. The human beings are to be fruitful and multiply. That is to bring life. And then there's this other aspect of the Sabbath that we just seem to overlook, that the 7th day is also blessed. And maybe you've never considered it, but because the day of rest is blessed, it also has the ability to bring new life, vitality, strength, energy, focus, clarity, and renewal. So the 6 days of work don't have this ability because they have not been blessed. And to be clear, the reason this ability to bring life is present isn't because humans were like, oh, dude, we should build like all-inclusive resorts. That would be a way that we could rest super well. The reason that rest does anything to the human soul is because God blessed rest to do something for the human soul. It's God's blessing, not our creation or our habits necessarily, that make rest a thing that is good for us. You see, if God didn't bless it, rest isn't anything. It's just another activity. And this reminds us then that we are not the authors or the authorities of rest, when we need it or why we need it. God created it. God blessed it. God is the author and the authority of rest, and what it is and what it does. So blessing contained then in the day of rest, a blessing that exists in a 24-hour period of ceasing, is a reason that we want to go, well, I'll wander into that, because there's a blessing of God in that space, in that time, that will do something for me. Next word, holy. This word is rich, it's heavy, it's weighty in the Hebrew. It's the word kiddush. And this word means to be set apart, not for common use, given to God. To just speak for a second to the significance of kiddush, this is a word that is sometimes used to describe God. God is kiddush. God is holy. It is a heavy-duty word in the Hebrew language. And the first time that this heavy-duty word appears in the Bible is right here in Genesis 2, verse 3. God made the 7th day kiddush. He made the 7th day holy. That is, it's not like the others. It is not common. It is set apart. It is special. It is unique. And don't miss this amazing detail. The very first thing then that God calls holy in all of creation is time. Did you hear me? The very first thing God calls holy in all of his creation is time. Not a place, not a person, not an activity, not family fun. Time. When God's creation was finished, the only part of creation that was holy was time. And this is worth thinking about, I think. Like, how would you do living in a world in which the only thing that was holy was a time period? It's like, what would we live like? I don't know that I would do very well. Because us people, well, we don't always remember that time is important too. God blessed the seventh day and made it holy. For humans, our priority is space. And I don't mean like outer space, though that's become the very popular last frontier in recent decades. I mean places in space kind of space. What happens at home, the garage, the church, work, the rink, the yard, the lake, the cabin. Space is in the material world that consists of all the many things that we love to touch and see and interact with. Even in religion, it's not about sacred time, it's about sacred or holy places. There are holy cities, there are holy temples and holy cathedrals, there are holy mountains, there are holy rivers, there are holy graves. But in Genesis, God doesn't call anything like this holy, he calls time holy. John Mark Comer says, "You would think that after creating the world, God would make a holy space, a mountain or a temple or a shrine. After all, every religion has a holy space. Islam has Mecca, Hinduism has the Ganges River, paganism has Stonehenge, baseball has Wrigley Field. But this God doesn't have a holy space. He has a holy time, the Sabbath." So because we cannot think outside of spaces, we could say, well, where is a holy place where I connect with a holy God? Oh, it's actually in a period of time. Now, maybe I'm easily amused, but I find it really fascinating and exceptionally beautiful that what was first called holy was time. We say things like time is valuable, time is money, time is short. And God knows that we have these cultural mantras written like the laws of Abraham and Moses on our heads. But when do we say to our colleague at the water cooler, time is money? Yeah, but you know what? Time is also holy. Probably because we weren't thinking about it. Now, I do want to add that people eventually came to be called holy. Before God gives the law at Sinai, he says, you got to become a holy people because I'm about to speak to you. And then the tabernacle becomes holy. And then the temple becomes holy. And you know when it became holy? It became holy after people worshiped a thing, a golden calf. After they were so addicted to, we've got to just worship a space, that God goes, okay, well, we're going to do this tabernacle thing, and I will fill up that space with my presence. But first it was time. And if the order of holy designations matters, if the order of the way that things were labeled time, if it matters, and to Hebrews it did, I think it does, then time being the first holy thing before people are placed probably should say something to us and give us a reason why participating in a period of 24-hour rest, why that might matter. So Abraham Heschel, Polish-American Jewish man, said, the meaning of Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. Stop. That's why we have such a hard time with it. Because we don't do anything like this. The meaning of Sabbath is to celebrate time rather than space. 6 days a week we live under the tyranny of things of space. But on the Sabbath we try to become attuned to the holiness of time. Sometimes I have to remind myself that I read these words dozens of times this week and you're just hearing them for the first time. I want to let them sink in. A day of rest allows us to remember and even protest that space is not all that there is. Space demands much from us, and we give much to it without really thinking about it. Yet space is not holy. And what is holy, we tend to ignore or mistreat. Now, this holiness of time doesn't mean that space and all the good places and the things that can take place in those spaces and places aren't valuable. Across 6 days, God creates lots of good things, and he calls them good. God made these things and he said they are good. He didn't bless them other than the people and the living creatures, but he called them good. And so they are good. And I'm not here to say that's not good. I'm not here to say God's creation isn't good, but it isn't holy the way time is. And so Sabbath is an invitation to come out from our addiction to space and things and to delight in the holiness of time, even though we've never thought about it before. Another why, and we're going to hang out in this time area for a bit here, but another reason why we find participating in a day of rest is then we remember that it is time that so often makes a thing we could call a space significant. So when I was a teenager, I was really into running track. While all my friends were playing hockey and baseball and basketball, I ran track. And I was fortunate enough to experience some pretty good success running track. And I kept the track spikes that I wore in some significant races. And I still have the shoes. I forget about them. But every few years, I accidentally am going through old stuff and I come across them and I look at them and I hold them. I see like the dirt from the long jump, sand stained on them. And I think about these shoes. But why I kept those track spikes is an illustration for the impact of time on space. You see, I kept the track spikes because a moment in time gave special value to those things. I did not keep them because they have much value within themselves. I've had many shoes over the years, and all have eventually become garbage. But I keep track spikes in a box in my shed because time made them special. Other people, I know Brian's one of them, will keep a special car or a significant tool from a loved one or an old blanket that grandma made for the same reason. What makes those things so valuable to us is not them within themselves, but the time that made them significant. And if you're not with me yet, what about the cross of Christ? Is the thing that made the cross the most recognized symbol in the world the Roman craftsmanship? Like, is this it? We made a wooden T. Oh my goodness, we should hang that on our necks for generations. I think it might have been that whole God dying for the sins of wretched people business, that moment in time that saved the world, that has now made this the most special of symbols. This isn't all that valuable, but time made it valuable. And it's not even just the cross. The Bible, time and time again, reveals the importance of time. God has placed eternity in the hearts of men. When the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, born of a virgin, born of a woman. We have a blessed hope of eternity, forever time. And so time is far more important than I think we always remember. And it's important for reasons so much better and richer and deeper and more significant than our material, greedy, or self-centered values, like time is money. Another reason why Sabbath invites us to know something amazing is because creation reveals God's glory. And I don't want to take away from that, but time reveals his essence. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim the work of his hands. Amen, and true. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, from everlasting to everlasting you are God. So we've talked about space and time, and they're both included in creation. And space is created and it is called good, and time is blessed and it is called holy. And each offer us something. Creation will always be the thing that reveals God's glory, amongst other things like his Son, Jesus Christ. But the skies do, the heavens do declare the glory of God. And I'm cool with that. We see God's glory when we see the sunrise or set, when we see oceans and their power, when we see deserts and their vastness, and forests and their seeming wisdom. As ages have gone by, we see it in the water that covers so much of our earth. We see it in hummingbirds and we see it in hippopotamuses. We see it in the wrinkled skin of newborn babies, and we see it in the wrinkled skin of those who have seen more of God's creation than they can remember. And God says it is good, and it points you to me. You see my glory. Creation reveals the glory of God. Amen. But creation does not reveal the essence of God. That's why we don't worship it. Yet time does. Time is eternal, though we don't always realize it. We don't always think about it like this. But time in the big picture is everlasting. And who else is everlasting? God. We once again turn to the brilliance of Heschel, who asks, "For where shall the likeness of God be found? There is no quality that space has in common with the essence of God. There is not enough freedom on top of the mountain. There is not enough glory in the silence of the sea. Yet the likeness of God can be found in time, which is eternity in disguise." This is what Pastor Brianne does when you read this to her. Oh. Where shall the likeness of God be found? There's no quality that space has in common with the essence of God. There is not enough freedom on top of the mountain. There is not enough glory in the silence of the sea, yet the likeness of God can be found in time, which is eternity in disguise. Oh my goodness. These thoughts, given through Heschel's language, are like awe-inspiring for me. Like, this was a moment where I was like, oh wow, that is awesome. I think that these words rattled in my soul all week. Time is eternity in disguise. Because time comes to us disguised as temporary and is fleeting. But the truth is, in fact, time is eternal, as is God. Therefore, in a way that space never can, time points us to the God who made us. Time points us to the one who is from everlasting to everlasting. And so when you or me choose to delight in a day of rest, a 24-hour block of time in which work and toil for the sake of enhancing space cease, we are delighting in the essence of an everlasting God. Wow. I thought I was just like letting my back feel better. The essence of God. So what have we said this morning? What is this sermon in a sentence? We should delight in a day of rest because God has blessed it and made it holy. If only his people could be amazed by that. This is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more that we're going to cover in this series. But today, this is enough, I think. But I'm going to leave you with a couple reasons and why these considerations matter to us today. So the first, and I've already touched on this, but I want to double down on it. We are made in God's likeness. Sabbath matters because we're made in God's likeness. He works and we work. He rests and we rest. And we ruin the icon that is the human when we refuse to rest as God did, as God made us to do. We ruin the image. Furthermore, we devalue the image of God in us, something that is so uniquely and exclusively human, when we give no priority to resting for a 24-hour period. No other creature can consider and celebrate time the way that a human can. No other part of creation can see the significance of time and pause from living a life that says space is all there is. No creature can anticipate tomorrow or the weekend or next year or a birthday or an anniversary or the birth of a child or Christmas morning. Only we can anticipate and care and put value on time. And so intentional living in space and time each week allows us to exercise a right ingrained only in human beings. Only people are made in God's image. And I'm pretty sure that that's a privilege that we don't want to devalue or waste. And then another consideration that I think is going to be helpful just to get this out here as we move into the rest of the series. This is a reason I think why we avoid Sabbath. We are afraid to slow down because stillness says too much. So work and busyness, restlessness, and always being on the go. These are usually defense mechanisms against thinking about real life. And we all know this. I don't think I have to convince anybody of this. Busyness is a distraction on purpose. It's a way to distract ourselves away from remembering and feeling the things we would rather not think and feel. Busyness is a way of medicating ourselves from the reality of our inner life. So we'll just exist in space where I don't have to think about me, who I am, where I'm going, who my friends are, how my marriage is, how my kids are. And then we get away with it because busyness is honorable, right? And it's accepted. Other forms of distraction are taboo or sinful or even illegal. We can't drink ourselves into forgetting. We can't gamble ourselves into forgetting because someone's going to come along and go, oh, I don't know if that's the best practice for you. But busyness, oh yeah, no, that's good because that says importance and work ethic and value. So we can do that. Sure, it means that we ignore all the major ways in which busyness plays in our stuffing down, all of our insecurities and all of our anxieties and all of our shame and all of our guilt. And we can just keep celebrating busyness with all the other busy people. It's a whole busybody party. No problem. Sabbath is scary. We don't want to admit that we're scared to rest. Instead, we just say, oh, I can't sit still. I was bugging my wife this week about this a little bit, or we'll say, I just have restless legs. Get the massage gun. My muscles are sore. Speaking of the fear of Sabbath, a pastor named John Starkey says, the Sabbath, however, does something terrifying at first. Terrifying. It brings stillness and quiet so that all the ghosts and goblins of our insecurities and anxieties come to the surface. This is true of spiritual disciplines in general. When I started fasting regularly, it actually was the catalyst for a healing in my life that I have been trying to figure out for like 20 years. It was actually fasting that got me on the right track. And it happened so quick where stuff started to come up. Sabbath will do the same thing. Because the day of rest is given to us and it is blessed to bring us life, to bring us restoration, to bring us renewal, and yes, to bring us even healing. And so our avoidance of it is ultimately an avoidance of facing what is going on and who we are and just what Jesus might want to do with all the crap that we have hurriedly worked through all week. Sabbath is a way to discover what needs to change and heal. It's a choice to decide to live in the restoration and renewal of God, which may feel like work at first, instead of, we could say it's a trade, it's replacing the exhaustion of guilt that most of us prefer over the hard work of change. And so as we move through this series, I suspect it will at times be challenging, scary, make you uncomfortable, make you feel frustrated, probably lead to a debate at home, maybe you and your or your spouse. Spice is probably better in this instance. Will probably lead to a fiery debate, maybe even an argument. How do we rest well? Yeah, exactly. You rest dumb. Because most of us have been conditioned for decades to do anything but slow down and be still. And then when we do slow down and be still, we do it with this distorted Sabbath according to our conditioning and our preferences and our little universe that we are Lord of and our laws. We rest right. And so we rest from our job, but we still exhaust ourselves by painting the fence or worrying about the job that we're resting from, rather than calling the work that we already did good and waiting for the next one, the next round to begin. So being challenged to evaluate and change, church, I don't know that any of us do that without a bit of growing pains. But I do think we can do it. I also think we have to do it. John Mark Comer, I'll probably quote this again. Maybe we'll quote it every week. He says, to not keep the Sabbath isn't a sin, but it's stupid. He says, and like to eat concrete isn't a sin, but it's stupid. We have to do it. And it's going to require new learning, new habits, and the Holy Spirit's help. Finally, thanks for your patience. Thanks for getting this off the runway. But I want to say this. This is why I think we have to talk about this now. I really sensed coming off Easter that Christians don't do very well at living in the accomplished work of Jesus, both physically and intentionally. We acknowledge it in our minds. We accept the finished work in our minds, but we don't do a great job of practicing that reality in our weekly rhythm. You know, sometimes the way that we rehearse an idea is the way that we're discipled into the idea. And so if we never do anything that says, Jesus finished it, so I'm going to rest, then I don't know how that ever really sticks. We have to somehow put our bodies into it. And so my hope is that the Sabbath, as we work through this, isn't a lesson in ancient Jewish practice and a confusing Christian adaptation of that ancient practice. But that Sabbath would be a way in which we come to celebrate the reality that Jesus has finished the work. And he sat down at the right hand of the Father, and therefore we actually can sit down too. Like, we're not going to work harder than Jesus. So certainly I think we would agree there is much need and much to learn. Simple prayer. Teach us to rest, Lord.